So, as Donna said, this this is a continuation of the part one of the presentation. Just want to quickly go over the previous part. The part was about how we got about doing this hiking trail, who was part of it. Originally, this was a trip that I was going to take my oldest daughter, visit my country, Sri Lanka, and show her before she was going to China, as she has planned to do some traveling, and then she was to do 3 months of Chinese in the southwest part of China as part of her college major. She was majoring in Chinese as one of her majors. The bomb blast in Sri Lanka made us that we have to change the itinerary. And we were initially going to go to India for a couple of weeks. But then my wife came up with an idea that reminded me that this was a bucket list, and we wanted to go do this. And why don't we just take this opportunity to do this? I have never. This is a very short trip. It's a round trip, 65 kilometers or 40 miles. Certainly, this was not in my radar to do this trip, but the trip was an ideal trip to take my kids because that's the amount of time that we had. So we went on this trip. So we ended up at reaching the terminal or the lateral moraine of Langtang Glacier. And we ended up at the village, the last village on the valley, the Kinjang Gomta. And we have climbed the Kinjang Ri, which is a standard of what people do. It's a valley trek as opposed to a circuit trek. As the name suggests, we walk along the river all the way to the origin of the river. And the village, last village on the valley was Kinjang Gomta. And then we will climb peaks around there to take a look at it. So that's where we ended up. Now, before I go into that, someone in the past asked me in the last meeting in the question Q&A, how do they build houses over there? So this is pictures that I took from where I was staying in Langtang. This is a village that was completely obliterated by the, I believe it's in 2015, the earthquake hit. This was one of the areas affected. So I just kind of looked into my archive and took some pictures. Most of the houses are, dry stack rocks from the riverbed. And you can see there they have corals that are made for the yaks out of dry stacking. The new houses also built with cement and wood. So here's a house that is being built. Typically, the houses are built in stages because of economics. They will build one part of it, and then they will go and build the other floor, another floor. This is another example that I took, how perfectly and how beautifully they have taken rocks along the river and then basically hand carved them and stacked them so tightly. And this was a house on progress that was being built along the track. These are some of the pictures that I took of the village, and you can see how the stones are dry stacked. There was no mud or cement in these ones. They were just basically beautifully kind of locked in together. I also want to, kind of interestingly say this, welcome to very happy guest house. Foreigners like hot showers, so they have hot showers, Wi-Fi. You had to pay, I think, $1 or something like that to get onto Wi-Fi. They have Western toilet as opposed to the squat toilet in Asia. They're double beds. Some other days, they wanted to say, I think, library facilities, and about 1 minute here too, and then there's a sign there, go to their place. So it's always interesting to read. So this is where we ended up. This was top of the Kinjang Ri. It's, I believe it's 15,500 or 600 feet. This point is. Behind here is the Mount Langtang, and that's the glacier that comes along the bottom of it. And the terminal moraine is behind us, and that's where the Langtang Kola starts. And from the trailhead, we follow this river all the way to the origin of the river. This is prayer flags. Usually there is a lot of prayer flags at the end of a point that you are going to get to. People also add prayer flags as they come and visit the native people. This was a black and white picture of the same area. Again, it's 27,000, I think this peak is. And at the altitude, the wind blows off the snow and then creates this puffy cloud. This is a close-up view of the Langtang mountain. Again, a zoom picture of the glacier that is coming down from the mountain. And our plan was to go and have lunch in Kenjan Gomta, and maybe in the evening visit the Gomta, which is a Buddhist monastery, which is an ancient monastery. And also there was a cheese factory that was closed the previous day when we visited. And then we were going to bushwhack along. If we climb up further, we could walk along the lateral moraine of this glacier and just kind of go as far as we can. We were aware it was summer and it was warm days, and we just want to be careful with avalanches and not in the path, and kind of bushwhack and explore this area for the evening and stay overnight, and the next morning start our hike back to our trailhead. This is the view of the village that we stayed from the top of Kenjangri. Again, here's the terminal moraine, and that's where the Kola starts. This is on our way down. And as I previously talked about, my daughter here, she is about, way ahead of me in descending also. This was a sign from the village how to get up there, a single sign, and there was a lot of game tracks, and you just had to kind of walk your way up to get to the top of it. So when we arrived at the village, my oldest daughter did not join because she developed GI problems, primarily diarrhea, overnight while staying there. And I had altitude issues, primarily headache and severe nausea. And my oldest daughter also had altitude issues from headache and nausea. My youngest daughter did not have any issues at all, whatsoever. So our plan was to stay here overnight and then start the hike down. But when we came around, my daughter was still having diarrhea, and then between that and then the fact that she has lost her appetite and very severely nauseated from health altitude issues, we decided we didn't want to stay here, but we would rather go down to a point where perhaps the altitude sickness will go away and then she could rehydrate herself. The worry was if the GI problem continued to happen, then she could get dehydrated and also get into electrolyte problems, imbalance, and then we will have an issue. So we wanted to prevent that. So we decided after lunch or whatever we can eat, we decided around 2:00 we'll just start hiking down. So here is my oldest daughter, and we were hiking down. I guess the picture that I primarily took here is to illustrate how the weather changes in the valley tracks. Typically, the weather is very clear up to noon, and then the cloud kind of moves in, and then towards the evening the visibility becomes very difficult. So this actually plays into the recovery or the rescue part of it. Here we are, and you can see it would be very difficult to land an aircraft or do anything from the air when it's around this time of the day. And it is very typical. Now here's a picture of the same area. The previous picture was taken from right somewhere here. This is in the morning when we came up here. As you can see how it is very clear, and there are some high altitude clouds, but it's basically the visibility is very good. And then comes evening, afternoon, 1 or 2 o'clock, then it turns into like this. Now, my youngest daughter was ahead of me, and we didn't know what was happening. She apparently ran into the person that we stayed in this village that we were going to stay, and he had come to pick up his horse in the pasture. And he knew that Lauren likes to ride horses, and she has a horse. So he put Lauren on the horse, and she rode the horse bareback all the way down to the village, which we found out when we got to the village. So in addition to walking, she also had a free ride on a horse in Nepal all the way down to the village, which I learned after coming. So we had dinner. We went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up. I checked in with my kids. Linnea continued to have diarrhea that night. She said she hardly could not sleep. She had maybe a small amount of sleep, but the headache was gone. Our appetite hasn't completely recovered, but we could eat something. So I was up. Our rooms were in the lower level. The kitchen was in the upper level. My kids were in their room. They were reading a book. So I just came up there and I was having tea and I was just looking outside. For the folks who have joining us this time, this whole white area is where the old village was. And I was told about 200 people died. Now, a village in Nepal would be the equivalent of, this would be the equivalent of the city of Minneapolis was completely destroyed by the earthquake. And all the people were buried in this rubbish, in the rubble. And they don't have the equipment to even find any of these people. The only house that survived is this house that's in the corner there, that's tucked underneath there. And here's a zoom picture of that house. That's the only house that survived that earthquake in 2015. So I was upstairs, as I said, I was having a cup of tea, and I started to feel chill. The temperature was somewhere around the mid-60s. People were in shorts. I was in shorts. I was very comfortable. And then I started to shake uncontrollably. I could not get myself warm, even though I was drinking hot tea. So I had to go down to my room, and then I got under the covers, and I was still feeling chill, and I was having the shakes. So I put on my jacket and got under the covers, and I continued to shiver and feel chill for about 30 to 45 minutes. And then it all stops with profound sweating, and I was completely soaking wet. My jacket, my Patagonia jacket was wet, and I was not sure what was happening because I was feeling great, and the altitude issue seemed to have been going away. So I went to the bathroom and decided, I'm just going to take a shower because I was soaking wet, and I coughed to clean my throat, and I saw there was blood. And that kind of surprised me because I was feeling fine. I didn't have any chest pain. I was having no shortness of breath. And I was actually feeling better than the previous day. So I decided I want to cough again to make sure that it wasn't like dry air. Then, I had a nosebleed or something like that. But this time there was, in what we would call medicine, frank blood. There was truly blood in when I coughed. I knew then and there, there is a serious problem has come up. And I have to really be cautious. I mean, a lot of alarms went in my head when I saw the blood. At this point, I was mostly concerned about my oldest daughter, who was having diarrhea, and I was concerned about her dehydration and electrolyte imbalance because she was also having the altitude sickness. And but this one scared me even more. So immediately I got into the mode of being a physician and trying to figure out what could cause this issue. The first thing came across my mind is, have I somehow developed high altitude pulmonary edema? So in reviewing our trip, my home is at 930 feet here in Minnesota. For the people who were not here last time, I was on a mission trip with a group of Californians in Zimbabwe before I came here. Harare, Zimbabwe is around 5,000 feet. I stayed there 10 days, and we conducted a week-long mission trip, a pediatric mission trip. We were doing cleft lip and cleft palate surgeries. My kids arrived in Kathmandu 2 days before I even showed up there, so they stayed around 4,500, 4,600 feet. The trailhead was Sefrabesi, that was 4,800. So they actually had 3 days at 5,000 feet before we started hiking. The first day we went to Lama, which was 8,000 feet. And we were in Langtang, which is a village that I was there. That was 11,000 feet. We didn't have any problems. Both my oldest daughter and myself developed high altitude headaches and nausea and severe nausea in Kenjan, which was around 12,000 feet. The next morning, me and my youngest daughter hiked up to Kenjan, which was 15,000 feet, and we were back in Kenjan, and then we descended back to Langtang at 11,000 feet. So I was not sure. I wasn't really impressed by that thought that this is somehow the high altitude pulmonary edema. Besides that, I couldn't explain why I was feeling chills and rigors, and I didn't have a thermometer to check my temperature, but it looks like I had an episode of fever. The second thought went through my mind is, have I developed pulmonary embolism? We have been on long plane rides. I was from here to Africa. That was a whole 1 day, 1.5 days. And then I came back from there. I had to fly to Nepal. Then we went a long 1-day bus ride. Could this be a possibility? We were dehydrated. Same thing, my kids flew from here independently to Dubai, to Nepal. So maybe I had pulmonary emboli. Usually it's associated with chest pain, shortness of breath, but I didn't have any of those symptoms, plus also the chills and rigors and fever. That was more evident of an infectious process. The third one was, could I have contracted malaria? Because I was in a malaria area, particularly the type of malaria called falciparum plasmodium can cause pulmonary hemorrhage. But it is kind of, we stayed there only about 10 days. It was the winter season there. It was at a 5,000 feet elevation. The mosquitoes were not there. Mosquitoes usually bite early in the morning and late in the evening. We were probably not out and about. We stayed in a resort, and we were out there early in the morning in the hospital working. So I don't ever remember mosquitoes biting. And also knowing the incubation period for malaria to develop, I didn't think that was possibly the reason. Then I came into the last possibility was maybe I've developed a secondary pneumonia, because what happened when I was there in the mission trip is it was the southern hemisphere, it was the winter season, the flu was in full swing in the southern hemisphere, and the first day when I arrived, when we went to the hospital, I had to see about 150 children, and half of them had runny nose, coughing, sneezing, and I had to see all of them, and then we were taking care of them. 3 days into the trip, I developed a very bad cold. I had fever and chills and muscle pain, and basically dragged myself through the entire process because I was the only anesthesiologist providing the anesthesia service. But by the time I got to Nepal, I have recovered from that, but perhaps not fully. Usually when a viral infection like that happens, it basically destroys your protective mechanism in the lungs, and it takes about 6 weeks to recover your lung functions back to normal. And it's not uncommon for people to get a secondary bacterial infection. And it looks like a perfect scenario to me, where immediately I went on a hiking trip. The hiking, the altitude, possibly the dehydration, the stress I have put may have transiently overcome my body to combat this problem, and I have developed a pneumonia. So and looking at all of these things, I figured I think the last one fitted this the case, the scenario that I had. And the next question I had to ask myself is, where am I going to go from here? I knew, being a medical person, this is a very dangerous situation, because I have seen in my life, in 30 years of practicing medicine, where in a matter of hours, people can get really sick, and potentially this can turn into life-threatening. The appropriate treatment would be the proper antibiotics to get definitive treatment. And I know the urgency, and where I could get definitive treatment, I had to be in Kathmandu. So then the question came is, how do I get from here to Kathmandu? We have a 17-mile hike from where we were to get to the trailhead. And with a pack, there is no way I could make 17 miles in one day. So it's probably 2 days into the trip. And then it's about another day of bus ride to get to Kathmandu. That puts me 3 days behind before I could get a definitive treatment. And I knew if I had to wait 3 days to get treatment, this problem will definitely turn life-threatening. Then the question is, I mean, so because there are no roads there, the road starts at the trailhead. The only way to get to the trailhead, either we hike down, or we had to be on a mule or on a horse to go there. I'm with two of my kids. And I contemplated with the idea, should we start the hike down and see how far we can go, or should we stay here and try to organize a rescue? My main issue was, what happens if I hike down and this all of a sudden in 2 hours down the line, if I get really sick, then how do I organize an evacuation? So I just want to remind, this is where I was. This is outside my hotel. It's the pasture land. It's very easy to land a heli and be rescued. If I continue the trail, this is what the trail turns into. After about an hour and a half of hiking, we'll get into a rhododendron forest. We'll be hiking along the river. And if I continue to hike down, and if I run into problem, and if I have to organize a rescue, this will be quite a difficult task. I have to go find a mule or a horse and go either uphill back to Langtang or downhill to the trailhead, and then I organize. I didn't have any phone service from here. I wasn't sure what will I have. So I decided, based on the terrain, that I should start the evacuation process right here. And there was only one way to get out of there, was to have a heli rescue. Once I made the decision, then it was a race against time, as I showed in the previous pictures, how the weather changes in the valley. By noon, the weather kind of becomes to a point that a heli will not land. You can't land a helicopter. You know, there are no airports, there is no radar screens and none of that stuff. Everything is, people fly by visually recognizing the structures and where they have to land. So I knew I also don't want to waste time and start the process right away. So I started around 8 o'clock. I made the decision, I need to start the process, because I thought, maybe in a couple of hours I could organize this thing, and before the weather turns bad. Now it was 8 o'clock in Nepal, and Eastern Standard Time was 9:15 in the US. I worked through the locals. They got the paperwork that I had for evacuation and also the passports of all three of us. They took pictures. They texted to someone in Kathmandu. They all know people, and they actually immediately got hold of a company that has helis that does evacuation, and they had a heli available within 20 or 30 minutes to come and pick us up. But the problem was, I was told that people have been abusing the system, and the companies have made very difficult to organize an evacuation process nowadays. And we have to get prior authorization from the companies before they could organize the heli evacuation, unless if I wanted to directly pay the money and then organize the evacuation, and then I need to work it out with the insurance companies. Now, I had picked World Nomad as for this particular purpose after following an article that was written by the New York Times travel editor, and they had actually evaluated all the travel companies. And the person, she was in Nepal, she was hiking, and the conclusion, she thought this was the best company. It was an international company, and she had, in based on her review, it was best. So I went with them. So I decided maybe I'll try organizing it through them. So I did pull out the paperwork and I called the customer service number. I talked to a gentleman and I explained to him who I was, what was happening, and what I need to do. And he listened to me and I said, I will get back to you. And then I never heard back from him. My wife was in Minnesota. So I called my wife and told her what was happening. I had two concerns. I have my daughter who is having, although the altitude issues has gone back, but she's still having diarrhea. I was concerned about her potentially getting dehydrated, although she wasn't. But I was not sure whether diarrhea was going to stop, what was going to happen in the future. And then I also told her what has happened to me, and I think I have developed pneumonia. So I just have to, we have to leave. She called the same number, and she called me back and said, Rohan, you talked to a call center in Maine, and you talked to a call center. All these, I learned later on, all these evacuation insurance companies, they have a call center. Like when you call, off hours, a medical person, goes to a triage line, and then the phone call end up in a call center in Maine, and that person is going to call the actual company, which is well known, and their head office is in Kansas, and they're going to reach out to them and talk to them about giving approval and organize this one. So the customer service number are basically a call center to screen the calls. I wasn't sure whether the call center in Kansas was open, because it was, by this time, it was 10:30 or 11 o'clock local time. Eventually, about a couple hours later, I got a phone call from a person from World Nomad, and I had to go over the same details with them. And I explained to them, and I'm with my two daughters. They have two concerns. Primarily, mine was more important. And I also told them, what are our choices, and the only way that we could get out of this situation is we need to be evacuated immediately. And I also explained to him the urgency of this because the weather was closing in. And the person told me that because I was in high altitude, they have a different team that does high altitude rescue, and that team is in Florida. And he need to contact them, and he need to talk to them, and they have to give me the permission, or the airlines the permission, to evacuate me. So they said they have actually paged the people who work in the office, because the office in Florida, now it's midnight in Florida, they have all gone, and they need to wake somebody up, and they had to come and look at all the paperwork, and then they need to give the go-ahead. And I was watching, and we started this process around 8 o'clock, and it was probably around noon, or maybe a little more than noon. And I decided, and I could see the clouds starting to roll in through the valley. And I decided that I was just going to call the heli company and said, just come and pick us up, we'll pay, and we'll go through the insurance company later. It came to the wire because the heli company who was able to come and pick me up initially, and they had serious concern about being able to land, because the cloud ceiling was getting more and more into the valley. And initially they were said that, they will come and pick me up. And then they were saying, we need to look at the weather. We need to check the weather. Several more phone calls, and I knew they were leaving. And they also, while he was flying, it was a half an hour flight from Kathmandu to where we were on a heli. He also called twice to make sure that he was asking me visually describe what the weather was in the valley. Just before he landed, about 10, 15 minutes before landed, I got another phone call from a different company asking me about who I was. And they have got authorization to evacuate me from the mountain, from World No Man's. And I told them I already had another company bringing us down there. And they said, they were very nice. And they said, they know these people. They will deal with them. They said, you don't need to pay any money, that we'll take care of it. Just go along with the helicopter. So this was the valley. And you could see how the situation was changing. It was clear and the clouds were coming in. It was actually starting to rain down the valley. The locals went and helped the heli person to land, find a particular area that they could land in the pasture land. Here they are. You can see the expression on her. Both of my daughters are very upset that we have to end the trip like this. So a half an hour heli ride brought us to the Kathmandu heliport. Normally, I would have enjoyed that heli ride, but I was not in the mood of enjoying that. An ambulance was there when we arrived there. My kids were like, "Dad, we are feeling great. Why do we need an ambulance?" I told them, we're just going to go along what the rules and regulations are. We're just not going to say anything. By this time, Linnea was actually starting to feel better, but I was starting to deteriorate. Up to this point, I was more worried about my kids because we were in a foreign land, in a foreign place. They have no experience. I have two daughters, and I'm coming across a serious problem. I'm worried about my daughter, and when I arrived there, I know we were safe, and I started to sort of relax. But then also I realized how ill I have become within the last 4 hours. The emergency medicine, the MD, she was very fluent in English. And she came up to me. She actually saw my kids first, and she came up to me and she said, "My kids are okay." And she looked at me and said, "You look really ill." By this time, I have spiked another episode of temperature. They checked the temperature. I was 102. I was coughing more blood. They did some labs. My white count was elevated, which is a sign of infection. I have already developed a pneumonia in my lung, in the chest X-ray. Again, as I said, this all started in Africa that I didn't realize, and it materializes over here. She said that I should be admitted to the hospital. She suggested I should receive IV antibiotics. And by that evening, I was completely out of it. I remember I was quite delirious. I had spiked fevers more. My kids told me the next day they will come to my room and they had put both kids in another room and myself in a room, that they were coming and talking to me, and I didn't really make any sense at all. I was talking gibberish, and they just eventually stopped asking questions from me. The next day I woke up and I was like, it was a night and day. I was fine. I've never been sick like this. And I was like surprised how wonder the antibiotics can, when you have the right diagnosis and you give the right treatment, how things can change very quickly. We were discharged that afternoon. I was given oral antibiotics for the next 10 days, which is the standard of care. I saw the ER MD the next morning, and she came up to me and she said, I'm really glad that you made the right decision, because most of the people would not have. Because the time that I found out what was happening, I was really feeling very good. And if I would have thought this was altitude sickness, and if it would have, then then the thought process will be start walking even further down. And I would have probably run into trouble a couple of hours down the line when I had the episode of fever. And then this would have really, really complicated, potentially life-threatening, try to organize what I did uh, from in the woods, trying to do it with no one around us. So we arrived in Kathmandu one day early, so we decided to do more sightseeing. This is a very famous Buddhist monastery, Buddhist Gomta in Kathmandu. It's a very interesting place. They have lanterns and lights and prayer wheels and prayer flags. And then people then come in the evening and they go around in the clockwise pattern. You see families, you see kids, you see monks, you see all kinds of people, saying prayers and going around this stupa. So it's also surrounded by buildings. There are monasteries here, there are restaurants up here, there are souvenir shops up here, and it's a beautiful atmosphere to watch people praying and coming together and worshiping. And again, some pictures of the temple. And this is where we are having dinner. So what was the take-home message? The take-home message is, first of all, before you go on an adventure like this, I think it's very important you had to investigate and you had to have the right insurance. Most of us are traveling from place A to place B, like we are going to Mexico. We take an insurance for trip cancellation, trip coverage. We may get some medical insurance, but if you're going on something like this, you have to have evacuation insurance. You need to make sure that you are getting it from a company that have resources in the local country and kind of how do they work. In 93, 94, when we went to the Everest region, we went to the American embassy, and then we provided the paperwork that we had for the evacuation insurance. The American embassy became our guardian. And if we had any problem, they will contact the American embassy. They will organize the rescue. But over a period of time, things have changed. And now we have more companies, more evacuation possibilities there. Now, what I didn't realize, what came across as a surprise to me was how the system has changed over a period of time. Also, I think one needs to be aware of when you are doing a trail, just be aware of what trail you're walking, what does it look like. We have new technologies, we have GPS, and including myself, normally in the old days when I will be hiking, I have a map and I will be following the map. I'll be looking at clues, I'll be looking at trees and areas, and I have memory. I will time to time, I'll stop and look back because on the way back, the scenery will look different, the trees will look different. So I always look back and keep a mental memory of where I am going. But we have all got used to this GPS and we don't even pay attention, we walk. And it became an important issue in deciding when to start the rescue process, where to go, should I descend further or should I stay there? Because as I showed in the pictures, descending further into the forest would have made this rescue impossible in a timely fashion. It's also important, the lesson is make sure, listen to yourself and also listen to others and watch others. Not everyone is open enough to say what's happening to them, but you can kind of sense how they're doing. I certainly did not understand how sick or how well they were getting. My kids were. They said they are having diarrhea and they were having headaches. But I think it's important to communicate and really understand what was happening with them, the full extent of it. I think this is something that I had a great opportunity, and I'm really blessed to have taught this lesson with my kids, is calling off a planned trip. This, as we have all seen and heard many people losing their lives or potentially losing morbidity, significant morbidity, when people forget or they are reluctant to call off a pre-planned trip. because of the money spent, because of the sacrifice they have made, and to themselves, their family. And an adventure like this will never come again. I've always taught my kids there's always another day we can come and do this. And it is important that we can't steer away from that. And there are so many examples that one could read where people have pushed the edge further and they never came back or they lost their lives. And also, many factors go into when do you want to call off your trip and when do you want to organize it. Certainly, understanding the time of the day, where we are and where we are, who trying to communicate. I think the thing would have gone differently if it was during the office time in US, if I would have made the phone call. But that was not the case. It was morning over there. It was, Nepal is 10 and a half hours or 10 hours and 45 minutes ahead of US. So it was in the nighttime. So it's, the time of the day played an effect on that. The weather, the communication ability. I found out 2 days before we arrived there, they have activated a 4G network in Langtang village as part of rebuilding the village. So we had 4G coverage. And also I found out, we had 2 different SIM cards with 2 different networks that we could have someone else give them money and they could add time into our SIM card. And also understanding the terrain, what the local facilities are, how does the local emergency medical service works, are very important when getting on an adventure. My personal learning was, it took me 5 hours to get the approval from the insurance company. Although the transportation mode was available within 30 minutes of initiating the whole process, I never thought that it would take that much time to get something going. And I'm really glad that we started early in the morning, because otherwise we would have never been able to get out of there, even though if they have given the permission to do that. So some final thoughts before I open it up for question and answer. Although it was not an unsuccessful trip from a trekking point of view, but we learned a lot of wonderful lessons and experience together. And to me, being a father and share my favorite place in the world with my daughters before they go on with their life, I consider that's an incredible opportunity to do that. They were able to see the beauty of the country, the people, the kindness, the openness, and the spirit of this place through the eyes. And the place touched both of my daughters in many different ways. I think they went over that last time when we were here. And as I said earlier, it is an important lesson to learn when to give up something and when to stop and when to push further. And it's important to know that. And overall, the purpose was to go there to show the place, but we walked away from so much than what we thought that we will get, that we thought that we would get off. So that's where I'm going to stop.